In the heart of Persepolis, the daughters of the King of Kings lived in gold, but slept in fear. When night fell, Xerxes summoned them, one by one. The man who ruled millions forced his own children into his bed, calling it purity, calling it divine blood. It wasn't desire, it was domination, ritualized, repeated, normalized. Ministers prepared them, priests justified him, and silence became law. History remembers Xerxes as a god of empire, but to his daughters, he was a god of cruelty. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The year was 519 BCE. Inside the royal palace of Persepolis, music drifted through marble corridors as servants moved with quiet precision. A girl named Art sat before a bronze mirror. She was 12, old enough to wear gold, but too young to understand the purpose of it. Her mother applied kohl around her eyes, brushed her hair, and told her not to cry. Outside, soldiers rehearsed parades for the coronation of Xerxes, the new king of kings. Inside, another kind of ritual was being prepared. In Persia, royal daughters were raised as symbols of divine purity. Their bodies, untouched, were proof that the king's blood was sacred. But under Xerxes, that idea turned inward. He decided that no man outside the royal bloodline could touch what was divine. Not even husbands chosen for alliance. The purity of the empire, he believed, had to begin and end with him. That belief became law inside the palace. Eunuchs managed the women's quarters like a sacred department. Servants learned to prepare perfumes and silks to the king's taste. Each movement, each gesture followed a routine, one that had been repeated many times before. When the summons came, no one spoke. The chosen daughter was bathed, perfumed, dressed in colors Xerxes preferred, then led through a hall where even the guards looked away. For the women of the palace, silence was survival. They had seen what happened to those who questioned orders. The priests spoke of divine union. Courtiers called it keeping the blood pure. But everyone knew what it truly was: submission. Art's mother had watched her older daughters disappear behind the golden doors. None spoke of what happened inside. When they returned, their eyes seemed older, empty. Art told herself her father loved her. That love, she thought, meant protection. That night, she would learn what power meant instead. As torches flickered in the corridor, an eunuch arrived with the summons. Her mother's hands froze mid-brushstroke. She whispered the words every royal child feared. "You will go to him. You will do as he asks." The music outside grew louder, almost drowning the sound of her footsteps. Each step carried her deeper into the truth of the empire, that even within the walls of gold, no one was safe from the man who called himself divine. For Xerxes, this was not a moment of lust. It was proof of control. By claiming his daughters, he claimed the unbreakable right to rule, to own what was sacred, to silence what was human. And for the young girl crossing that threshold, the empire's glory ended where her childhood did. The belief that a king's blood carried divine essence did not begin with Xerxes. It was inherited from Darius the Great and from Cyrus the Conqueror before him. Persia's royal line claimed descent from Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of light and order. That idea, once meant to sanctify leadership, slowly evolved into a political weapon. By the time Xerxes came to power, it no longer served faith, it served control. When Darius died, the empire stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. It governed through tolerance, trade, and law. Yet, inside the palace, another form of law ruled: purity of blood. Royal marriages were no longer just political arrangements, they were theological statements. To mix with those outside the divine line risked diluting the sacred essence that legitimized the throne. Xerxes understood this system perfectly. He was not its inventor, but he was its most ruthless engineer. After securing the throne, he ordered a full reorganization of the royal household. Hundreds of women from his father's harem were absorbed into his own. The rest were reassigned to temples or estates, catalogued like property. The palace officials recorded each woman's lineage, age, and origin. In these lists, daughters appeared not as family members, but as extensions of royal blood. Within the marble walls, that phrase justified everything. The official explanation was simple. The king, being divine, purified what he touched. The act itself, no matter how violent, was sanctified by its purpose: to keep the sacred blood unbroken. Priests repeated this idea in their hymns. Court poets echoed it in praise. Over time, it hardened into ritual. Every step in the process followed a protocol. The girl chosen for union was washed in rosewater, dressed in linen, and anointed with myrrh. A priest recited a verse invoking purity. The ritual ended with silence. The next day, the records marked her as completed. There was no language for pain, only completion. This was the machinery of theology turned into administration. And like every efficient system, it required participants. Eunuchs enforced the logistics. They were trained to obey without question, believing service to the king outweighed morality. Physicians ensured the daughters remained physically presentable. If injuries appeared, they were treated quietly. Mothers were taught to cooperate, to prepare their daughters without protest. Resistance could end not in punishment, but in disappearance. In time, participation became routine. Servants memorized what oils the king preferred, which jewelry he favored, the timing of his moods. What should have been a household of life became an institution of procedure. Outside the palace, the empire prospered. Roads expanded, trade flourished, taxes filled treasuries. To foreign envoys, Persia appeared unshakable. But the real foundation of Xerxes' rule was psychological, obedience built on silence. If even royal daughters could not refuse him, who in the empire could? Each act of control reinforced the myth that the king's will was divine law. Priests began teaching that Ahura Mazda's spirit flowed through Xerxes directly. To question him was blasphemy. To disobey him was sin. In the temples, murals showed the king surrounded by fire, symbol of sacred light. His daughters kneeling in painted devotion. None of them smiled. To outsiders, these images were artistic allegory. To those inside the palace, they were documentation. The first cracks in this system appeared quietly. Some daughters began refusing food, shutting down emotionally. Palace doctors labeled it melancholy. Mothers who wept too openly were replaced by attendants who would not. Yet the machinery kept moving. The empire's priests could forgive rebellion on the frontier, but not a whisper of rebellion inside the royal bloodline. Xerxes saw that fear worked better than affection. A trembling daughter was proof that divinity had no limits. It was not enough for subjects to obey. They had to believe that even the king's own flesh belonged to him. That belief became the moral center of the empire. Outside Persia, rumors spread. Greek envoys whispered of unholy rites in the royal court. Most dismissed them as propaganda. Even Herodotus, decades later, struggled to separate fact from legend. But fragments survive. Records of gifts sent to priests, of silks ordered in the exact quantity as purification oils. Administrative evidence of a spiritual system run like a business. To Xerxes, purity and loyalty were one. He believed divine blood gave him divine rights, but it also demanded proof. Each time a daughter submitted, he reaffirmed his cosmic claim. In his mind, the empire's stability depended on that repetition. The ritual turned horror into maintenance, abuse into continuity. This logic extended far beyond the palace. Nobles began imitating the model, marrying cousins, isolating wives, controlling bloodlines in miniature copies of the king's household. What began as one man's pathology spread as political culture. Families learned that power required possession, that daughters too could be instruments of lineage, not individuals of choice. Behind every triumphal inscription Xerxes commissioned, behind every declaration of divine favor, the same truth pulsed quietly. The divine bloodline was not sacred. It was self-cannibalizing. It fed on its own to survive. In the archives of Persepolis, clay tablets record the expenses of the royal women's quarters. Perfumes, textiles, medical herbs. The same bureaucratic handwriting that listed grain shipments also logged the costs of preparing daughters for the king. In those ledgers, abuse became budget. And yet, to the outside world, Xerxes remained the embodiment of empire, radiant, disciplined, ordained. The priests said his rule was eternal, but the more he clung to purity, the more he hollowed out his own lineage. Within a generation, his daughter's trauma would infect the nobility, their children born into fear instead of faith. But for now, the illusion held. Persia looked invincible. Its roads were perfect, its treasury overflowed. Its king called himself divine. Inside the palace, though, a single truth echoed through corridors lined with gold. The more sacred the blood became, the less human it was allowed to be. The coronation of Xerxes was meant to symbolize renewal, a new sun rising over Persia's vast empire. But behind the gold-leafed proclamations and processions, it marked something else. The moment when royal power turned fully inward, when the machinery of empire began consuming its own blood. At the ceremony, Xerxes stood before nobles, priests, and foreign envoys beneath the great arch of Persepolis. The air shimmered with incense and heat. Courtiers praised him as Kshayathya Kshayathyanam, King of Kings, the living bridge between heaven and earth. Every word, every gesture carried the weight of ritual. To question it was unthinkable, but what no one dared speak of was the other ritual taking shape behind the palace gates. One that did not crown him with glory, but with control. In the months following his coronation, Xerxes reorganized the royal household with the same discipline he used on the battlefield. Every servant, every eunuch, every concubine was entered into a registry. Roles were defined, protocols written down, punishments standardized. The women's quarters were divided into ranks: concubines, consorts, and pure-blooded royals. That last group included his own daughters. What had once been a family became a hierarchy. The harem was no longer simply a collection of women. It was a political institution, run with the precision of a ministry. Eunuchs became officers of order. Priests became moral accountants. Every act within those walls, even acts of cruelty, was reframed as maintenance of divine structure. Witnesses later described how the daughters' lives followed a predictable rhythm: days of seclusion, ritual bathing, preparation for summons. When chosen, they were escorted through guarded corridors where no one met their eyes. The sound of their steps echoed against the marble, and when the doors closed behind them, silence became absolute. Inside, Xerxes spoke little. He didn't need to. The ritual spoke for him. The act was stripped of intimacy, reduced to affirmation, proof that divinity required no consent. When it ended, the girl was dismissed, and the attendants swept in to clean and prepare the next. It was a system, efficient, repeatable, faceless. Over time, the palace adapted around this new rhythm. Servants learned the pattern of the king's demands as if studying scripture. Scribes logged the times of each summons in coded notation. Medical attendants maintained ointments and herbal mixtures to conceal injuries or exhaustion. To an outsider, it might have resembled routine household management. Inside, everyone understood it was the machinery of fear. Some daughters stopped speaking. Others performed obedience perfectly, believing that flawless submission might grant them safety. None were protected. Every gesture of compliance only confirmed Xerxes' power, and that made it sacred. Religion followed where violence led. Court priests began preaching that the king's household mirrored the cosmos, his daughters embodying purity, his actions divine correction. This doctrine turned horror into theology, binding those within the palace tighter than any chain. Even Xerxes' political council began to adopt his language. When decrees were issued about loyalty or treason, the metaphors came from his own household. The pure must remain within the circle, the impure cast out. What began as private ritual became the logic of empire. Beyond the palace, few suspected the scale of what was happening. Envoys saw the grand processions, the architecture, the disciplined armies, all symbols of order. None saw the psychological empire taking shape behind the walls. Within that order, the daughters' suffering became invisible, absorbed into the state's idea of virtue. There were whispers, of course. A midwife dismissed after tending to one of the royal women spread a story to her kin before vanishing. A physician, transferred to a frontier garrison without explanation, left behind a note describing ritual exhaustion among palace girls. Each rumor died quickly. Fear moved faster than truth. To Xerxes, the system worked. His daughter's silence confirmed the natural order. Their obedience mirrored the submission he demanded of provinces and generals. If the royal household could endure absolute power, so could the empire. In that logic, pain became proof of strength. During feasts, he sat surrounded by nobles who praised his lineage, unaware, or pretending not to know, that every toast to divine blood echoed the cries buried in the marble halls. He looked at his daughters across the table, veiled and still, and saw not victims, but symbols, living evidence that his will extended beyond mortality. By the second year of his reign, the transformation was complete. The royal household was no longer a family, it was doctrine. It taught that loyalty required silence, that faith required surrender, and that love could exist only as obedience. Within that design, there was no space for innocence, and no way back to humanity. The empire would carry this invisible doctrine outward, into its armies and laws, until cruelty and order became indistinguishable. But the cost of that perfection had already been paid, by those who could never speak of it. By the third year of Xerxes' reign, the palace had become the blueprint for the entire empire, a structure where power moved smoothly, quietly, without resistance. Inside the walls of Persepolis, silence was not absence of sound, it was the language of survival. The king's private rituals were no longer a secret. Everyone within the palace knew what happened to his daughters. The eunuchs who escorted them to his chambers, the attendants who prepared the rooms, the physicians who treated them afterward, the priests who blessed the process as divine purity. Each person held a fragment of truth, and that truth was heavy. But none of them spoke. Silence had become the first law of the court. Eunuchs managed the routine with professional precision. Their neutrality was their armor. They could not question orders, only execute them. To hesitate was to risk punishment, not only for themselves, but for their entire household. They mastered the art of looking away. One held the lamp, another closed the door. A third wiped the tears before anyone could see them. It was bureaucracy in its most terrifying form, cruelty reduced to procedure. The priests played their role just as efficiently. They reinterpreted scripture, claiming that divine light required sacrifice. The king, they said, is both Father and God. Through him flows the essence of creation. In this warped logic, the suffering of the daughters became a sacred duty, their silence an offering to the cosmic order. To question it was not only treason, it was heresy. Within that structure, even compassion turned dangerous. A nurse who tried to comfort one of the girls was reassigned to a distant province. A eunuch who hesitated before opening the king's door was never seen again. Over time, fear replaced morality. The palace no longer needed violence to enforce obedience. The fear of being noticed was enough. Official scribes were ordered to document every aspect of palace life, except one. The registers recorded food, gifts, and ceremonies in detail. But when it came to the royal women, there were only vague entries. Attended, anointed, presented. The absence of words became its own form of censorship. To the record keepers, omission was loyalty. Outside the palace, the same logic began to spread through Persia's bureaucracy. Governors modeled their courts after the royal system. Precise, secretive, unquestioned. The empire learned from its master. If the king's will was divine, then every local ruler became a small god in his own province. Orders passed down through layers of fear until silence became the empire's most reliable infrastructure. Merchants, soldiers, and servants all knew that conversation about the royal household was forbidden. Even whispers could be fatal. When rumors surfaced among workers at the palace granaries, stories of princesses hidden away or sent to remote estates, officials moved swiftly. The men who had spoken were conscripted into the army and disappeared into foreign campaigns. The women were reassigned to temple labor. The empire had mechanisms for everything, even rumor. The mothers in the palace understood this better than anyone. They lived under the same roof as their daughters, but could do nothing to protect them. They were expected to prepare the girls, to bathe them, dress them, and instruct them in obedience. Refusal was not an option. They learned to detach, to fold grief into silence, to act as though they were proud. It was a survival performance that required more endurance than the rituals themselves. Each layer of the palace depended on another to maintain the illusion of order. The priests sanctified the acts, the eunuchs carried them out, the physicians repaired what could be seen, the scribes erased what could not. Together, they formed a perfect circle of complicity, a system where everyone participated and no one could claim innocence. What made this structure so enduring was its simplicity. It did not rely on constant violence. It relied on predictability. Every day followed the same rhythm: the king's meals, the prayers, the summons. When a daughter's name was called, no one gasped. The pattern had been rehearsed into the walls themselves. Even the torchlight seemed to understand its role. For those inside, time began to lose meaning. The daughters learned to anticipate the sound of approaching footsteps. The eunuchs learned to sense when the king's temper changed. The priests adapted their sermons to his mood. Each part of the machine adjusted to the pulse of one man. Xerxes had achieved something no conqueror before him had managed: absolute internal control. The conquest of lands was easy. The conquest of thought was harder. Inside Persepolis, he had both. In the empire's records, these years were marked as a period of peace and prosperity. Roads expanded, taxes flowed, temples gleamed. To historians centuries later, it appeared as stability. But inside the palace, stability meant paralysis. No one dared to move, to speak, to remember. For the daughters, silence was not just command, it was inheritance. Every moment of obedience became a lesson passed down. Survival requires forgetting. They learned to lower their eyes, to erase expressions, to breathe without sound. The palace produced not rebellion, but emptiness. Yet, beneath that silence, something else was forming, a quiet corrosion. The same fear that held the court together was beginning to eat away at its foundation. Servants avoided each other's eyes. Eunuchs drank in secret. Priests whispered doubts to foreign envoys. Fear, once perfect, began to multiply into paranoia. The machine of silence, built to preserve the empire, had begun to consume it from within. And as Persepolis glowed each night under torchlight, its marble halls polished to reflect perfection, no one inside could hear what was already beginning: the faint, irreversible cracking of the empire's moral core. In the women's quarters of Persepolis, time no longer moved forward. It circled, a quiet loop of waiting, silence, and dread. The daughters of Xerxes lived in perfect stillness. Every sound, footsteps, a door sliding open, the rustle of robes, carried meaning. Each could signal another summons. Some prayed. Others counted the nights between visits, building patterns from fear. All of them learned that the only safety was invisibility. The rituals had turned them into fragments of the same idea: purity. They were told from childhood that their bodies existed to maintain divine order. When they were summoned, it was called service. When they returned, silence was mandatory. The language of trauma did not exist in the Empire's vocabulary. There were no words for what was happening, only the phrases of religion and loyalty. At first, the girls tried to speak in whispers, comforting each other after the doors closed. But whispers were dangerous. The walls carried sound, and the eunuchs always seemed to know. One girl, barely older than 13, disappeared after murmuring that she wanted to run. Her bed remained empty for weeks, then was filled by another. No one asked where she went. The lesson was clear. Forgetting was survival. Psychologically, this silence hollowed them out. Some learned to leave their bodies, to drift during the ritual, to watch from a distance, to become ghosts inside their own minds. The palace physicians called it faintness or trance. In truth, it was a defense, the only way to exist without collapsing. A few of the older daughters adapted differently. They studied Xerxes' moods like scholars. They memorized his preferences, his gestures, the rhythms of his voice. Obedience became performance. If they could predict what pleased him, they might suffer less. Some even learned to appear grateful, believing that convincing him of loyalty might protect their younger sisters. It rarely did, but hope, even misplaced, was a form of endurance. Others broke entirely. They stopped speaking, stopped eating, stared for hours at the carved ceilings where painted gods looked down without mercy. Their mothers begged the priests for healing rituals. The priests prescribed prayer and incense. When that failed, the women were sent to remote estates, quiet exile dressed as mercy. The court never acknowledged their absence. In official records, they were marked as withdrawn from service. What made this horror sustainable was the Empire's ability to translate it into duty. When pain becomes doctrine, the mind reshapes itself to survive. The daughters told themselves that submission was destiny, that their sacrifice upheld the stability of the Empire. The priests reinforced this idea, calling them keepers of divine purity. To resist would mean breaking not just the law, but the universe. Over time, they internalized the logic. If they obeyed, they lived. If they broke, they vanished. Fear turned into routine, and routine into faith. One of Xerxes' younger daughters, Mandane, later described in a letter, preserved only in fragments by Greek historians, how she survived by reciting verses silently during each ritual. "I leave my body," she wrote, "and wait for the sound of the lamp being extinguished." That sound marked the end. It was the only rhythm she could control. This dissociation, the mind separating from the body, became a form of rebellion disguised as surrender. In a world where no one could say no, detachment was the only way to remain alive inside. Outside those walls, no one suspected the depth of their suffering. To the public, the royal daughters were symbols of luxury and holiness. Their names appeared on temple lists, their images carved on palace reliefs, serene, adorned, untouched. The illusion was complete. The Empire displayed purity while burying its pain. Even within the court, the cycle created confusion. Some courtiers began to believe the daughters were blessed, chosen for proximity to the divine. They praised them publicly, offered gifts, and wrote hymns in their honor. None understood that those same hymns were used to justify their captivity. The human cost of this system was invisible, but The psychological effect spread far beyond the palace. The courtiers learned obedience from the daughter's example. Ministers learned silence from the eunuchs. Mothers learned to hide fear behind ritual. Every level of society absorbed the same lesson. Survival required complicity. Inside the palace, the daughters lived between two selves. One trained to act, one hidden deep within. They spoke softly, moved carefully, smiled when required. Their voices became echoes of the king's will. Yet in private moments, in darkness, after the lamps were out, they remembered pieces of themselves, a childhood song, a scent of the gardens, a glimpse of freedom that now belonged to another life. It was this internal double life that kept some of them alive. They could not resist the system openly, but they could preserve something small, the thought that the silence was not consent, that obedience was not faith. But even this quiet defiance had its limits. Each time they were summoned, the mind retreated further. Each year, fewer words were spoken in the women's quarters. What began as individual coping became collective numbness. The palace functioned perfectly because its victims learned to disappear without dying. And though the empire saw only calm, that calm was built on a generation of daughters who no longer knew where fear ended and faith began. Their minds became the truest reflection of Xerxes' rule, vast, ordered, and completely silent. If the palace was a machine of silence, religion was the oil that kept it running. No empire endures by fear alone. Fear breaks the body, but faith binds the soul. Xerxes understood that to preserve absolute power, he needed both. The Persian court priests, the Magi, were masters of adaptation. Under earlier kings, their duty had been to interpret the will of Ahura Mazda, god of truth and light. But under Xerxes, that duty changed. They were no longer mediators between God and man. They became interpreters of the king's desires. The divine voice now spoke only through him. When whispers of the king's family rites reached the temples, the priests faced a choice: condemn him and risk annihilation, or redefine morality so that he could never be guilty. They chose survival. The new theology they crafted was elegant in its simplicity. Since Xerxes was descended from the divine, his actions were by nature beyond corruption. If the king touched something, it was purified. If he desired something, it was destined. If he broke something, it was already impure. In sermons delivered to nobles and soldiers alike, they called it the doctrine of sacred blood. It claimed that royal flesh was the vessel of cosmic order, a boundary separating chaos from creation. Through this logic, even the king's daughters were no longer human in the ordinary sense. They were symbols, instruments of divine equilibrium. What he did with them was not sin, but maintenance of the universe. The priests knew how this sounded. They also knew that in Persia, questioning theology was more dangerous than questioning law. And so they crafted their words carefully, embedding them in ritual language. They called the process Dayina Yazata, purification of divine spirit through contact with the source. Each ceremony reinforced the illusion that the king's private violence sustained public harmony. Inside the palace, the effect was immediate. The priests began blessing the women's quarters before ceremonies, offering incense and prayer as though preparing a temple. The walls, once human, became sacred. The abuse became liturgy. Those who hesitated, a priest who refused to attend, an attendant who wept during prayer, were quietly reassigned to distant provinces. The Magi's sermons grew louder as their faith grew thinner. The more they justified, the more they feared silence might reveal the truth. To outsiders, this transformation appeared as religious revival. Temples flourished, rituals multiplied, offerings increased. But beneath the surface, belief was decaying. The people prayed not out of devotion, but because ritual had become law. Each time a priest spoke the king's name alongside Ahura Mazda, divine and human fused into one. And that fusion left no space for conscience. In the inscriptions Xerxes ordered carved across the empire, his name always followed the same pattern. Xerxes, king of kings, favored by Ahura Mazda, whose blood is eternal. That final phrase, whose blood is eternal, did not exist before his reign. It was invented theology, a political formula masquerading as scripture. To the untrained eye, it looked like piety. To those inside the court, it was a shield. The Magi, once guardians of morality, became administrators of justification. They wrote scrolls declaring that to share in the king's blood is to share in his divine nature. Some historians later interpreted this as metaphor for loyalty. But in Persepolis, it was literal. It was the sacred mask placed over a crime no one dared to name. This religious scaffolding reached deep into Persian society. Nobles began copying the king's language, claiming divine ancestry for themselves. Fathers used the rhetoric of purity to control their own households. Across the empire, the concept of holiness merged with possession. Women became symbols of lineage, their worth measured by proximity to sacred blood. The palace had become a model, replicated, admired, imitated. The true power of the Magi's doctrine lay in how completely it inverted morality. In normal faith, holiness is measured by restraint, the ability to rise above desire. In Xerxes' Persia, holiness was measured by domination, the right to consume without consequence. The priests blurred the line between devotion and obedience until no one could tell them apart. A few among the clergy resisted quietly. Records from later reigns mention a magus named Oropastes, who vanished after questioning the king's purity doctrine. He had written, "If the source is divine, why does it fear the mirror?" The fragment was erased from official archives but survived in Greek accounts. It stands as one of the few recorded acts of conscience from within Xerxes' court. But for most, faith had become a profession. Ritual replaced reflection. The hymns that once celebrated creation now described hierarchy. They told the people, "Light descends from the king to his seed, and through his seed the world remains in order." The daughters heard these words too. For them, they were another cage. Each chant in the temple was an echo of their own silence. The same story repeated in marble and fire. When they bowed before the altar, they bowed to the system that devoured them. In time, religion and monarchy became indistinguishable. The Magi blessed every campaign, every marriage, every death decree. Each blessing was a confession of dependence. The empire's priests no longer guided souls. They managed power. To the people, Persia shone with divine order. To its victims, it was order without morality, the perfection of obedience. And as the fires of worship burned brighter, the light no longer illuminated the truth. It blinded those who served it. By the middle years of Xerxes' reign, the palace had learned how to make things disappear, not through execution, but through ceremony. The king no longer needed to hide his daughters in remote estates. There was a cleaner way to erase them: marriage. When a daughter reached a certain age, she was suddenly celebrated. Gold was polished, hymns were sung, priests recited blessings that sounded like redemption. But every wedding was, in truth, an act of disposal, the state's most elegant form of silence. In the empire's archives, these events appeared as triumphs of diplomacy. The records read, "Princess Mandaine given in union to secure loyalty in the West. Princess Roxana united with noble blood to strengthen the royal house." But none of those words described what these women actually were. Not brides, not partners, not even property in the ordinary sense. They were liabilities. Each carried memories that could fracture the myth of divine purity. And so, one by one, they were married off, not to save them, but to remove them. The nobles who received them knew exactly what they were accepting. To marry a royal daughter was to receive both privilege and silence. These unions bound families to the throne, but they also made them complicit. The price of royal favor was complicity in its crimes. Among the first was Artaxerxes, one of Xerxes' elder daughters. She was married to a high-ranking general, a man old enough to be her father. At the wedding feast, guests praised the union as divine alignment. But the general's face, preserved in inscriptions, carries the stiffness of a man who knew too much. His reward was wealth and command. His punishment was what he could never say aloud. After marriage, the daughters vanished from public record. Some moved to distant estates. Others became names on temple lists, donors of gold and grain, offerings likely made on their behalf, not by their hand. The Persian court's chroniclers stopped mentioning them altogether. Officially, they had fulfilled their duty. In truth, they had been buried alive in titles and ceremony. This system of holy marriage solved two problems at once. It cleansed the palace of witnesses and extended the reach of the king's authority. Each noble who took a princess as wife owed his future to Xerxes. Each child born of these unions carried both royal legitimacy and inherited silence. It was political genius disguised as mercy. For the daughters, marriage was not freedom. It was another transfer of ownership, this time written in stone and law. Their new husbands often treated them with careful reverence, not affection. The princesses were symbols, dangerous ones, carrying divine blood and the shadow of the king's will. Some were guarded constantly, isolated within their new estates. Others were used as tools of alliance. Their children pledged to future pacts before they could walk. A few, according to later accounts, tried to speak. One daughter, named Artune in Greek sources, reportedly confided in her handmaid, saying she would rather die than live as an offering. Within a month, she was found drowned in the palace well. Officially, it was described as a ritual cleansing gone wrong. The message was unmistakable. Even after marriage, the silence followed them. The psychological toll deepened. These women were no longer victims only of the king. They were trapped in a society built to protect his myth. Their trauma became part of the empire's design. Every noble court that received them repeated the same cycle of denial. Call it destiny, call it purity, call it peace. And because the marriages looked legitimate, history remembered them as ordinary. Relief carvings show processions of brides carrying garlands, their faces serene. The inscriptions list offerings, dowries, and prayers. Not one mentions the reason these women could not return to Persepolis, or the nightmares they carried from it. The religion of sacred blood made even their suffering untouchable. To speak of it was to question the divine order. To question the divine order was to threaten the empire. And so, every household that received a royal bride also inherited the duty of silence. This is how Xerxes perfected his control. The empire no longer needed guards or chains. It used ritual, marriage, and memory itself as tools of confinement. The women who could have exposed him became proof of his greatness. Adorned, paraded, and erased. Some Greek historians, writing decades later, mistook this pattern for generosity. They called Xerxes benevolent to his daughters, marrying them to men of stature. They could not see the cruelty beneath the formality. To them, Persia was a land of magnificence. Its women clothed in silk, its temples glowing with gold. They never saw the silence behind the light. By the end of his reign, nearly every surviving daughter of Xerxes had been married off. The women's quarters grew emptier, the rituals fewer. The king, aging and increasingly paranoid, turned his obsession outward, to generals, to court rivals, to omens carved in stars. But the system he built around the women remained intact, replicated by others, refined through repetition. In the empire's administrative tablets, one line appears often in those final years. The duty has been fulfilled, the record is complete. It wasn't. The daughter's absence was not completion. It was concealment. And somewhere in the western provinces, among the estates and shrines that held their ghosts, a new fear was forming, one that no ceremony could contain. By 480 BCE, Xerxes no longer ruled only from Persepolis. His will travelled on ships, echoed in war drums, and marched with 500,000 soldiers across the Hellespont. He told his commanders they were carrying divine justice to Greece. In truth, they were carrying the empire's corruption with them. When Xerxes left for the campaign, he brought part of his harem and several of his daughters. Official inscriptions described it as a procession of the royal household meant to project divine legitimacy on foreign soil. But among the generals, everyone understood the unspoken purpose. The daughters were there not as symbols of faith, but as extensions of the king's control. War magnifies every hierarchy. At the front, generals obeyed Xerxes, as priests obeyed his gods. The army's morale depended entirely on the illusion that he was infallible. To maintain that illusion, he turned his daughters into living instruments of motivation. After the bridge across the Hellespont was completed, a monumental feat of engineering, Xerxes rewarded his lead architect not with gold, but with access to Princess Roxana for one night. The man was honored publicly and destroyed privately. Those who witnessed it said he returned hollow-eyed, suddenly devoted beyond reason. It was the perfect test of loyalty, fear dressed as favor. From then on, the pattern repeated. Commanders who won skirmishes or built fortifications were invited to receive royal grace. In the official logbooks, these encounters appeared as private banquets, feasts of blessing. But the euphemisms fooled no one. The princesses had become currency, divine flesh turned into reward. Even the soldiers knew. Rumors rippled through the camps that the king's daughters could bless victory, that to share their presence was to share in divine power. For men who marched and bled under the Persian sun, the promise of such contact made obedience almost religious. Xerxes had discovered something darker than fear, desire manipulated by faith. The logistics of this system were staggering. Royal wagons followed the army, sealed with curtains and guarded by eunuchs. The women were moved like sacred relics, hidden from public view, yet constantly prepared. Attendants kept records of perfumes, garments, and ritual baths. Before each presentation, priests invoked blessings to frame what followed as Holy Communion. What had once been confined to the marble halls of Persepolis was now mobile, a traveling theatre of domination, cloaked in incense and law. The daughters endured this silence on the move. To them, the shifting of the wagons, the endless noise of soldiers, the dust of the road, all of it was another version of confinement. Some retreated inward, clinging to fragments of memory. Others accepted numbness as their only refuge. They had learned long ago that survival required disappearance. General Artabanes, the commander closest to Xerxes, received one of the daughters, Mandane, as gift of divine favor. He was a loyal servant, but not blind. Afterward, he began to see cracks in the system. The king's obsession with control was turning his army into an echo of the palace, efficient, terrified, and hollow. Even victories felt strange. When Persian forces crushed small Greek cities, Xerxes ordered mass sacrifices to celebrate divine purity, blending religious ritual with bloodshed. The priests called it cleansing. Soldiers called it routine. By then, few remembered what the empire was fighting for. The conquest of Greece had become a mirror of the king's inner empire, a campaign to erase resistance itself. The daughter's presence deepened this hypocrisy. Publicly, Xerxes claimed they accompanied him to bring luck and remind the army of the empire's divine lineage. Privately, their existence was leverage. Every commander who accepted the king's blessing carried a secret that bound him forever. It was loyalty by corruption, the kind that ensured obedience long after the battle ended. The campaign's failure exposed the cost of this system. When the Greek fleet shattered Persian hopes at Salamis, Xerxes withdrew to Asia with what was left of his dignity and his daughters. The wagons that had once been paraded like shrines now moved quietly through the night, curtains drawn, lamps extinguished. In the aftermath, the army's morale collapsed. Generals distrusted one another. Soldiers whispered of divine disfavor. The king's obsession with purity, once a source of unity, had become a curse. The very ideology that justified his control had hollowed out the will of his empire. Xerxes returned to Persia with his faith shattered and his paranoia sharpened. The campaign that should have immortalized him instead exposed what he truly was, not a god of light, but a man enslaved to his own system. In the ruins of the retreat, the daughters' wagons were found abandoned by some accounts, guarded, sealed, untouched. The soldiers who opened them said the air smelled of incense and rot. There were no bodies, only silks and gold ornaments, as if the empire had shed its humanity and left only ornament behind. When Xerxes finally reached Susa, he ordered new inscriptions carved into stone. The king's line remains pure. His will is eternal. The irony was lost only on him. The war had ended, but his daughter's torment had traveled farther than any army, carried in silence, sanctified by law and immortalized by lies. The empire had conquered nothing. It had only exported its disease. When Xerxes returned to Persia after the humiliation in Greece, the empire still greeted him with music. The temples rang with hymns. The priests declared the retreat a strategic purification. The inscriptions spoke of divine patience, not defeat. But beneath the gold, something had cracked. The King of Kings no longer trusted anyone, not his priests, not his generals, not even his own blood. The failure in Greece had exposed the limits of divinity. If he was chosen by the gods, how could mortals defy him? The Magi tried to answer with ritual and praise, but Xerxes no longer listened. He turned inward, toward the only space he could still dominate completely, the palace. Inside those walls, paranoia became policy. The same daughters who had been paraded as sacred symbols during the campaign were now summoned more frequently. Each visit was more violent than the last. It was as though Xerxes sought to erase his defeat through control, to reclaim the godhood that Greece had denied him. The palace physicians, forbidden to keep records, noticed the change. They called it divine agitation. In truth, it was the collapse of a man who could not live without absolute power. His nights grew longer. He drank heavily, ordered endless ceremonies of purification, and demanded omens from the stars. The Magi, desperate to maintain favor, offered interpretations that turned his rage into cosmic will. The gods test their chosen, they said. Only through suffering is purity renewed. It was theology as anesthesia. In those years, Persepolis turned cold. The gardens still bloomed, the marble still gleamed, but the laughter was gone. Courtiers spoke in whispers. Eunuchs avoided eye contact. The daughters moved like shadows, their steps soundless against polished floors. Even the musicians played softer, as though afraid the air itself might betray them. Xerxes began purging the court. Old generals who had failed him in Greece were accused of treason. Nobles who hesitated to flatter him disappeared. Some were strangled quietly, others were exiled to distant satrapies. The empire that had once seemed infinite now felt small, shrinking to the size of the king's fear. The daughters became both his obsession and his proof of authority. Every time he summoned one, the act was more than cruelty. It was ritual reinforcement of his divine image. The priests continued to bless these ceremonies, though many had stopped believing in their own words. A few drank themselves to sleep after the prayers. One magus, unable to endure another night of falsehood, walked into the sacred fire and did not return. His death was ruled as a union with light. For the women, survival required something beyond obedience. They perfected stillness, the art of disappearing even while present. Mandane, one of the eldest, learned to anticipate her father's moods from the tone of the drums outside his chamber. If they beat slowly, the night would end quickly. If fast, she prayed for fainting. Roxana, the one who had once been paraded as a war blessing, stopped speaking altogether. She communicated through glances and gestures with her attendants. Her silence became legend, the mute princess favored by the gods. The palace bureaucracy learned to mirror the same logic. Ministers avoided decisions until they could read the king's mood. Every decree began with the same phrase: "By the purity of the royal will, let it be done." Each signature was an act of submission disguised as faith. The empire's outer provinces still functioned. Taxes collected, armies maintained, temples funded. But internally, rot had set in. Governors bribed inspectors to falsify grain counts. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers. The fear that once held the system together had begun to devour its trust. When power becomes absolute, it no longer requires competence, only obedience. And obedience, unchecked, eventually destroys itself. For the daughters, the collapse of divine order offered no relief. It made the violence less predictable. Xerxes' mood swung wildly, from days of drunken generosity to sudden executions. The palace air smelled of wine and incense, of perfume and decay. He ordered new sculptures of himself, larger, harsher, carved into the cliffs of Nakhsh-e-Rustan. In these reliefs, he appears calm, offering tribute to Ahura Mazda. But beneath the stone serenity, the real man was unraveling. The last known reference to the royal daughters in Persian records appears around this time. A brief line on a temple tablet. Offerings made by the House of Light in honor of the king's eternal lineage. No names, no faces. Just the phrase, House of Light, a euphemism for the women who could never be acknowledged. Then the entries stop. Greek accounts from later years suggest that several of the daughters were quietly executed after a failed plot within the palace. The names of the conspirators were erased, their estates confiscated. Some historians doubt this story. Others believe it was true, that even silence can reach its breaking point. What is certain is that after 465 BCE, Xerxes was dead, murdered in his own bedchamber by Artabanes, the same general who had once received his favor. The chronicles say Artabanes killed him out of ambition. But perhaps it was something else, the act of a man who had seen too much, a blade finally drawn against the embodiment of divine hypocrisy. When the king's body was found, the priests performed the final purification rite. His daughters were not allowed to attend. They had served their purpose, first as symbols, then as tools, finally as ghosts. The doctrine of sacred blood died with him, but the silence it created outlived them all. In the end, Persia did not fall to Greece or to gods. It fell to its own perfection, a system so complete, so total, that it could no longer tell the difference between worship and rot. When Xerxes' body was sealed in its stone tomb, the empire buried more than a man. It entombed the silence he created. His son Artaxerxes ascended the throne under the same formula carved into the palace walls. Favored by Ahura Mazda, keeper of the eternal blood. But the faith behind those words was already gone. The new court inherited everything Xerxes had built: the rituals, the priests, the bureaucracy of obedience, but none of its conviction. The machine kept moving because no one knew how to stop it. The Magi still performed purification rites. The eunuchs still enforced order in the women's quarters. And the daughters who survived their father's reign became living relics, reminders of what happened when divine authority devoured its own family. One of them, Mandane, was sent to a distant estate near Pasargada. There, she lived under watch, described in one surviving tablet as Keeper of the Royal Sanctum. It was an invented title. In truth, it meant she was too dangerous to be forgotten, too broken to be seen. Visitors later recorded that she spoke little, spending hours staring toward Persepolis, the city where her childhood had been traded for empire. Her children, born from arranged marriages, carried her silence. They grew up in homes where affection was measured, emotions were whispered, and obedience was instinct. The trauma had become generational, a code written into behavior rather than memory. For them, fear wasn't something imposed, it was inherited. Across Persia, the same pattern unfolded. Nobles who had once imitated the king's doctrine of sacred blood now found themselves haunted by it. They had married daughters and nieces into their own lines, convinced purity brought stability. Instead, it brought suspicion and decay. Families turned inward, strangled by secrecy. Every act of control created new fractures. The very logic Xerxes had perfected, purity through domination, had infected the empire like a hereditary disease. The priests, stripped of a divine monarch to serve, became political functionaries. They maintained the rituals out of habit, not faith. Some began to reinterpret the old scriptures, subtly undoing the theology that had justified the king's crimes. They replaced divine blood with divine truth. A quiet correction meant to restore balance, but it was too late. Once faith has been bent to power, it never fully straightens. The daughter's story lingered as rumor, whispered by servants, hinted at in foreign accounts, erased from Persian inscriptions. Greek historians like Herodotus and Ctesias recorded fragments that Xerxes kept his family close, that his women were not free to choose, that the royal line suffered from strange madness. These fragments, though filtered through bias and distance, preserve a truth the empire itself refused to name. Inside Persia, poets and scribes began to encode dissent through allegory. They wrote of gardens that bloom without light, and lions that devour their cubs to prove strength. These were not fables, they were veiled confessions. Every line was a quiet rebellion against the empire's inherited silence. Even architecture carried the mark of guilt. After Xerxes, no Persian king built another harem on the same scale. The royal compounds grew simpler, less adorned. Reliefs showed kings praying, not commanding. Power had learned the cost of pretending to be divine. Still, the damage endured in subtler ways. Generations of nobles raised in a culture of obedience lost the ability to question authority. The trauma of submission, born in the palace and distributed through ritual, made rebellion nearly unthinkable. When Alexander the Great eventually marched into Persia a century later, he met not a roaring empire, but a quiet one, orderly, efficient, and hollow. The soldiers fought, but their faith was gone. The empire collapsed from the inside out, like a body that had forgotten how to breathe. The tragedy of Xerxes was never just what he did to his daughters. It was how his actions became the blueprint for rule. He turned love into ceremony, fear into loyalty, faith into policy. And in doing so, he created a state incapable of self-reflection. For his descendants, silence was both inheritance and prison. They were taught that speaking truth would break the world, but the world was already broken. One ancient inscription from the late Achaemenid period, likely written by a court scribe, captures the lingering shame in a single line. We served the light until it burned our faces. It is the only known text that refers indirectly to Xerxes' reign. Short, restrained, but devastating. A civilization that once claimed divine perfection had finally found the courage to admit it, had blinded itself. And yet, the bones of that empire still whisper beneath the sands of Persepolis. Archaeologists have uncovered women's quarters sealed behind walls, vessels with perfume still faintly fragrant, and inscriptions scratched onto clay tablets, faint, desperate etchings of names that never appeared in royal archives. They are not confessions. They are reminders. Proof that beneath every system built on silence, someone still tried to speak. When historians read those fragments today, they find not the glory of kings, but the residue of fear, the real legacy of Xerxes' empire. Centuries passed, the marble cracked, the gold faded, and the empire that once called itself eternal dissolved into dust. Yet the logic that Xerxes perfected, that absolute power sanctifies itself, never truly died. It survived under new empires, new names, new gods. In the chronicles of history, it appears again and again. The pattern is always the same. A ruler declares himself chosen. His desires become doctrine. His violence becomes virtue. And the people, trained by fear, rewarded for obedience, mistake order for justice. What Xerxes did to his daughters was not a singular act of cruelty. It was the prototype for every system that turns the private will of one man into the law of a nation. Rome learned it first. When emperors called themselves sons of gods, they too demanded purity, not of blood, but of loyalty. Their court rituals echoed Persia's logic. Control begins at home, then expands outward. Caesar's assassins justified murder as purification. Nero's fire was framed as cleansing. In each case, power found a way to disguise corruption as sacred duty. Centuries later, monarchs in Europe would repeat the same formula. They no longer spoke of divine blood, but of divine right. Kings claimed that their authority flowed from heaven, not from the consent of the governed. When they silenced dissenters, they called it defense of faith. When they executed rivals, it was the will of God. The vocabulary changed, the structure did not. Even modern regimes have inherited the same architecture. The language is bureaucratic now. National security, cultural integrity, moral preservation. But beneath those phrases lies the same idea Xerxes carved in stone, that those in power define what is sacred, and that questioning them threatens the world's order. Psychologists studying totalitarian systems describe it as the sacred illusion of control. It begins with a myth, a father who protects, a leader who sacrifices, a god who speaks through flesh. That myth becomes policy, then ritual, then instinct. And by the time the people realize they have mistaken fear for faith, the machinery has already rebuilt itself. Xerxes' Persia was not unique. It was only the first empire honest enough to call its control divine. Every system that followed merely learned to hide the language better. In this sense, the daughters of Xerxes were not just victims of a man, but of a world view, one that sees obedience as holiness and silence as peace. Their suffering was the foundation of a philosophy that would echo through centuries of rule. To govern completely, the ruler must redefine morality itself. The modern mind recoils from ancient horrors, but the pattern persists in subtler forms. Corporations that demand devotion beyond reason, governments that justify cruelty as stability, movements that claim purity as excuse for persecution. Each time power divorces itself from accountability, it resurrects Xerxes, not in name, but in structure. Historians often say that Persia's failure was military, that Greece defeated it through strategy and courage. But the deeper defeat happened long before Salamis. The empire collapsed the moment it began believing that power could purify itself. When rulers stop fearing consequences, when institutions serve obedience instead of truth, collapse is not a matter of if, but when. In the archaeological remains of Persepolis, a pattern of damage tells a story. The reliefs of kings remain largely intact, their faces untouched. But in the lower carvings, the attendants, the servants, the women, the stone is chipped, defaced, eroded. Time has preserved the powerful and erased the powerless. Yet, the silence between the fractures speaks louder than the inscriptions. Every empire since has inherited this imbalance. History remembers the tyrants. Memory carries the victims. That is the true inheritance of Xerxes' rule, not the architecture or the conquests, but the template of control through sanctified violence. What he did to his daughters was worse than death, because it made survival a curse. It forced them to live as proof of divine corruption. And that paradox, suffering justified by power, has repeated in palaces, prisons, and parliaments ever since. To study Xerxes is to confront the uncomfortable truth that civilization's progress has never erased the instinct to dominate. It has only made it more efficient, more procedural, more polite. The sacred ledgers are gone, but the accounting of pain continues, written now in policy papers, in treaties, in silence. If power is left unexamined, every age becomes a mirror of his. And though Persepolis lies in ruins, the empire he built still breathes. In the language of authority, in the rituals of control, in the quiet acceptance of what should never be normalized. Because Xerxes did not just teach history how to rule, he taught it how to forget. The ruins of Persepolis stand silent now. Columns rise from the desert like broken ribs. The carvings of kings, still immaculate, watch over a plain of dust. Yet beneath that silence, beneath the marble, the ash, the centuries of forgetting, the record continues to speak. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments the empire never meant to leave behind. Tablets with half-erased names, faint notations in administrative scripts, perfume jars buried with no ceremony, and rooms sealed without explanation. They reveal not triumph, but concealment. The ledgers once used to measure the empire's wealth now measure something else entirely: the cost of its delusion. In those fragments, we can trace the outline of the real Persia, the one Xerxes tried to bury under divine order, the one where the sacred bloodline was built on silence and fear, the one where the most powerful man alive turned his own children into instruments of proof that nothing was beyond his will. History once called that purity. We know now it was pathology. For centuries, chronicles praised Xerxes as the king of kings, conqueror of nations, master of the world's wealth. But the bones tell another story. of women confined, children unnamed, attendants executed, and a court that mistook obedience for virtue. The inscriptions glorify marble. The ground beneath them remembers flesh. And yet, through those remnants, something remarkable endures. Resistance in its smallest form. Scratches carved into clay by anonymous hands. Perhaps a servant, perhaps a nurse, perhaps one of the daughters themselves. One fragment reads, barely legible, "I am still here." 3 words, hidden for millennia, preserved by accident, defying the empire's perfection. That single line speaks louder than all the proclamations Xerxes ever engraved in stone. It is the voice he tried to erase, and the proof that even under the heaviest silence, memory resists. This is what the bones teach, that history is not only written by the victors, it is whispered by the survivors. The empire's marble may endure longer, but it is the broken that tells the truth. The big question we began with was this: how does an empire, the pinnacle of law, ritual, and civilization, turn its violence into holiness? How does power persuade itself that cruelty can be sacred? The answer lies not in the crimes themselves, but in their normalization. Xerxes did not invent evil. He institutionalized it. He wrapped it in theology, bureaucracy, and ceremony until it ceased to look like evil at all. His priests blessed it, his ministers recorded it, his people accepted it. That is the final perfection of tyranny. When domination no longer requires force, only belief. Every empire since has faced the same temptation: to turn silence into virtue, to rewrite morality as stability, to make forgetting a civic duty. But archaeology, like memory, does not obey kings. Each unearthed tablet, each restored inscription, each fragment of bone is a rebellion against the lie of divine order. They remind us that power, left unchecked, always finds a way to call its violence justice, and that the task of history is to strip away that disguise. The ledger of Xerxes has long been closed, but its numbers remain. The cost of empire was not measured in gold, but in people, in daughters turned into doctrine, in silence mistaken for faith. When we speak their names, when we read the evidence, confront the documents, and let the bones speak, we reopen that ledger, not to glorify the past, but to account for it. Because if power can sanctify cruelty once, it can do so again. And the only defense against that recurrence is the act Xerxes feared most: remembering. So when you look at the ruins of Persepolis, don't think of conquest or splendor. Think of the children whose silence sustained it. Think of the voices that tried to break through the marble. Think of the ledger that once claimed purity and now records only loss. History does not forgive. It excavates. And when the dust settles, it always finds what empires hide. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak.